discussion. So I've discussed the resistance along the more or less around the social class axis. And I want to now move on to talk a little bit about the rise of Chinese, various Chinese nationalistic discourse in response to Western critiques of China. And I've projected this guy here over 3 hours, and this is the face of China's new middle-class nationalism. And he's the guy, he's the founder of this website. I'm sure some of you may have heard about it. It's called ntcan.com. 23-year-old undergraduate grad from China's Tsinghua University and independent entrepreneur, internet entrepreneur. And when he saw the CNN critique of, the Chinese as, what is it, buffoons or whatever, and he actually got a message from when he was chatting with his friends who study in the U.S. So what you have is this kind of transnational flow of population, especially students, right? So he started to build, set up his ntcn.com, and then he suddenly brought to national, international attention when a Western journalist raised a question about him in front of the Chinese Foreign Ministry's at the conference, news conference. So suddenly he become a figure. But so what I want to, okay, where is it? So, and then, you have this massive protest in New York and many other places in the world, the global cities, where the Chinese were saying, okay, the students say, where is our voice? CNN, be truthworthy, tell the truth. And this is very, this slogan, it's exactly actually the slogan that the Chinese newspapers used in '89 when they demonstrate in front of the People's Daily. People's Daily, where's the truth? We want truth. And also, this protest happened on the date May 4th, 2008. But May 4th is a very significant date in modern Chinese history because that was the date, May 4th, 1919, that was the birth date of modern Chinese nationalism, really, in response to the Paris Peace Conference, when Western powers were carving up China, or and especially, has to do with colonial possessions of Japan, German, all that kind of thing. So May 4th gave birth to modern Chinese nationalism, and then the more radical element of that Chinese modernist movement ended up being the communists, right? So more than almost a century later, the Chinese found themselves still protesting against, this time, again, defend China's territorial integrity in the case of Tibet. And also, what they think as a kind of national humiliation or humiliation of Western racism, right? CNN's coverage. So some of these critiques expose Western hypocrisy, really, but do not have a progressive anti-capitalist class politics. And so what you have is in place Chinese rising capitalists or bourgeois nationalists that we want our space in the global political economy. We want China to be the next, won't say imperial power, but we want to make it in your game. That is, in the game of competitive capitalism. So here is that paragraph, which is actually carried by, translated by Financial Post, Financial Times. So a line that circulates very widely, internet message. So it really articulates that logic of the inspirations of China's nationalism, but it's very a kind of, we just want to be in your game, capitalist game. So when we close our doors, you send gunboats and opium to open markets. When we embrace free trade, you blame us for taking away your jobs, and it goes on. So, in the end, when we search oil like you did, you call us genocide, which is the implicit reference to Sudan, right? So this is a line of critique, and in a sense, okay, well, if you talk about capitalism developed by all means, including imperialism, then here we are. We're doing it. But so be consistent. Don't blame us, because your discourse is not consistent. So they have every reason to point out this kind of hypocrisy, right? So there's that argument. So I would call this a kind of right-wing, really, Chinese nationalism. But they would just say, okay, we're following your footsteps. But this is not the only critique, actually. There are articulations of more critical, anti-imperialist, international forms of a popular nationalism, which the government could neither associate with nor claim to speak for. And so there's an emerging new leftist intellectuals who argue that we have a nationalist tradition that's very different. It's a more internationalist. So, for example, so not all forms of Chinese popular nationalism are narrow-minded, dangerous. Most of what you heard from the U.S. media probably is the more right-wing kind of more threatening form of Chinese nationalism. For example, Lu Xinyu, who is a communication scholar, a scholar who focuses on documentaries, Chinese documentaries, and a good friend of mine, actually, she said, there's an internationalist orientation that links the emancipation of the Chinese nation with the emancipation of all weak nations in the world. And there's a pursuit of justice, equality in both domestic and international relations. And this is not a kind of statist-centered nationalism that focuses solely on economic interests. That is, as reflected in the previous quotation. And she argues that this is at the heart of the legacy of 20th century modern Chinese nationalism that goes back not just Mao, but to Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the founding father of the Chinese Republic. So in this struggle, the current discursive struggle in China among China's creative industries, or especially the media realm, you have intellectuals, new left intellectuals, try to articulate a form of Chinese nationalism that's, in a sense, progressive. If people will say, okay, nationalism is always reactionary, there's no such a thing as progressive, but I think there's a difference between kind of right-wing nationalism and progressive nationalism that is based on the equality of nations, in arguing for that kind of equality, fairness, justice in a global arena. And these kind of scholars were arguing that this is the nationalistic tradition, the legacy of Chinese nationalism, not the rising right-wing type of nationalism that China is going to be the next capitalist state dominating the world. And also, another very prominent left-wing, or being labeled now left-wing, because in China, as I said earlier, or within the Chinese intellectual discourse, being left is really, really bad. Not like it's not bad anywhere else, I guess, but because being left is being associated with the Cultural Revolution, the specter of the Cultural Revolution really served the same way of being delegitimizing any discourse like communism in a right-wing authoritarian regime. And Chomsky talked about anti-communism as one of the filters in the U.S., but in China is Cultural Revolution, and the label being left. So these scholars, for example, people like Wang Hui have for a long time resist being labeled as the left or new left, but then there's no way they can be called anything else, I suppose. So people like Wang Hui, for example, have been arguing about, for example, try to put out arguments about the issue of Tibet, and also saying that, the issue of Tibet really underscores profound difference between Chinese and Western notions of national integration. He was arguing that, and as I say again, underscore that by that flag, carrying 56 nations, ethnic groups, said the Chinese model is a kind of empire model, where the nation state, it's more like it's different from the ethno-nationalism for example, what you see these days in the Balkans. So each ethnic group must have their own nation, which is very much like a more European or Western ocean of national. Anyway, there are all that kind of discussion going on, and he argues again that overseas Chinese protests were engaged in a politics of struggling for national dignity, equality, justice in a global order, still dominated by the West. So leftist scholars foreground the point that the global order is still unequal. China is in no way in par with the U.S. In many ways, like what I discussed earlier, Chinese production is still, in the lower value, lower end of the value chain. China doesn't have the the military power, with the U.S., military base all over the world, that kind of thing. But so they acknowledge that there is this still inequality. At the same time, of course, in the context of the U.S., current, fear of China rising, this argument doesn't seem to go very far. But there are, if you assess China's national, the military power, economic power, there's argument that it's not like China rising tomorrow, that kind of thing. And they still acknowledge unequal power relationships. And also, moreover, they want a Chinese nationalism that is on the side of global justice, equality, rather than a Chinese nationalism that say, hey, okay, it's our turn to be the imperial power. So for its part, the state, on the one hand, has tried to appropriate popular nationalism, while at the same time try to contain it. When it tries to endanger its economic, I would say dependency, I will change that. Its strategic relationship with the West, and also the interest of transnational capital, because right now the Chinese state are really in bed, seriously, with transnational capital. So for example, when the official media, for example, were very quick in voicing disapproval of popular mobilization for a boycott of the French supermarket chain Carrefour, because it's the biggest foreign-owned retail supermarket chain in China, when the Chinese nationalists organized a boycott because the French government was very on the forefront of against the Chinese state, or at least in their articulated support of the protest against the Chinese state during the Olympic torture rally. So the Chinese state, and again, if I said earlier that it's the Chinese state that suppressed leftist social voices, the Chinese state actually has also been suppressing nationalistic voices, including news reports that's unfavorable to the U.S. For example, I don't know if any of you remember, there was an incident that involves the U.S. bug the airplane, or the equivalent of Chinese Air Force One, that was supposed for Jiang Zemin, the Chinese president, to use. So when the Chinese state received the airplane, they saw a spy bug, something the U.S. put there. So this is very humiliating for the Chinese nation. And also it doesn't show a picture of the U.S. friendly, right? So the Chinese state suppressed the news for the Chinese people, including network, internet discussion about that incident. So again, this is not the kind of censorship story you will get in the U.S. So the Chinese state has, on the one hand, yes, play up nationalism when it fits their purpose, or especially the harmless, depoliticized ones like the Olympics ceremony. But at the same time, it has been trying to suppress more popular nationalism. But and this is a statement I really like. It's again from this book by Lin Chun, a scholar who has write this book called Transformation of Chinese Socialism. So as long as the global liberal ideology with an open or unspoken anti-communist and racist influence continue to be perceived as destabilizing, with the collapse of Soviet Union in the background, official fear and public caution readily join force in China. So again, if you talk about why civil society discourse, liberal discourse doesn't seem to resonate in China, there is the national aspect. And again, that's the difference between kind of Korea, Taiwan, because in Taiwan, Taiwanese nationalism and the struggle for democracy goes together. In Korea, you don't have to, while Korean civil society groups were organizing, they don't have to articulate against the U.S., really. The U.S. is in helping. So in the case of China, the situation is much more complicated. So if historically the weak and vaguely proposed liberal solution fell through in revolutionary China, because of the liberal colonial alliance, the constant economic and political China bashing at the present had a similar impact. The Cold War survived in hard globalization to keep the concept of imperialism alive. So this is really, the complicated intersection between class and nation that I want to foreground. So what I'm going to do is, and also come back to something that just flip through one of my earlier things. In the discussion about culture and you talk about active audience, right? But what you see, especially in that ntcn.com guy, it's an active audience. But then he is, rather than, he's mobilizing himself and his groups against Western discourse. And that is the active audience. That's agency. That's not the active audience that decoding Dallas, which is, for those of you who are in communication culture studies, say, oh, there's no cultural imperialism. You have Chinese audience actively organize themselves as the agents of anti-imperialism or anti-West. So for me, that's the kind of agency also that's very relevant. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I am going to read through just a page and a half of my conclusion. So partly it's this, but I have something else. So in this age of transnationalized class formation, many members of China's ruling communist elite are said to be ruling naked in China. What does that mean? Not that they do not dress up, rather, this refers fictively to the widespread phenomenon of Chinese officials stripped themselves of their families by sending their spouses and children along with them illegally accumulate wealth to the West. So for the Chinese ruling elite under neoliberalism with Chinese characteristics, that's the term that David Harvey used, not only there's no society, as Margaret Thatcher once famously says, let alone a socialist society, but even individuals and their families have strategically relocated themselves to different nations to secure maximum personal advantage. I came from Vancouver, and I know many of those families. It's always the women who, the upper-class Chinese transnationally integrated women who stay in Vancouver, raise the children, and then husband in China. And I heard that. So there's even, I know this is outrageous in a sense, and I don't want you to take me too seriously. Vancouver is supposed to be the global village of the first wives of the Chinese ruling elite. That is the one that they sent to retire people of my age, and so they will go there, take care of their grown-up children. Normally it's one that 15, 20-year-old, and then when they came to Vancouver, they gave birth to a younger one. But then, so these women are totally bound in Vancouver, but they're the first wives. And I know such families. And then I heard, and you can prove whether it's the case, Los Angeles and the Irvine area are the second wives. That is, the younger wives wear the cape. I don't know if it's true or not, but that's, so global village really means something to the China's ruling elite. Vancouver is the village of the first, retired wives, and Los Angeles, Irvine, was the village of the second wives. But I also actually, for example, during the long weekends, China nowadays have several long weekends. Yes, you do have crowded flights coming from China to visit the wives. And I actually, when I book my ticket, I try to avoid those weekends because it's going to be very crowded, especially if you want to get an upgrade or something. Okay, so this is a transnational class formation. I talk about papers. I always want to write a paper about the life and also the mediation of the life of these first wives, because they are so depressed. Actually, they are not very happy. And my title is "Don't You Want Me Anymore?" That's the first sentence they articulate when their husband found, because this is the connection, right? And so it's like, "Don't you want me anymore?" And And so class, gender, and the mobility, immobility of transnational business class women in Vancouver, something like that. But I've never got a chance to write it. If any of you want to do a PhD dissertation, if you have any access, please, and I will be more than happy to be your external examiner or whatever. Okay. Meanwhile, okay, so this is the other side. Meanwhile, women Christian believers belonging to underground rural churches in China claim that they were not afraid of suppression by Chinese government, not because they can count on the protection of the God, but because, guess what? The president of the US, George Bush, is a Christian. That's what they believe. So I have this Chinese scholar I met at the Harvard conference I went about a month ago. He had interviewed a huge number of Chinese Christian believers in the hinterland, China's hinterland, rural areas mostly, the most depressed areas of Chinese economy, the third world, the fourth world, and many of these believers are women. And when they said, when he asked them, "Are you afraid?" He said, "No." They said, "No, because Bush is a believer of Christian believer." So that is very significant. So again, you have this misplacement of state, power, authority, geography, which is something that people like Saskia and Sassen has been writing about. But yet, paradoxically, as China is further integrated into the global order, members of China's increasingly denationalized middle class are articulating their transnationalized nationalism and waging struggles for China's territorial integrity and national dignity in the global symbolic arena. Thus, as China's still nation-bound, workers and the peasants are making redistributive and social justice claims on the state and propelling it to fulfill its socialist promise from inside. So you have workers make claims on the state to fulfill its socialist promise inside. Then you have China's increasingly denationalized middle class try to protect the state or support the state from outside. So that's the interesting dynamics at this point. So the historically specific rearticulation of a nation class not only continue to prop up or bluster China's post-revolutionary state in the order of global capital, but also make it impossible to completely shed its socialist color. That's why, kind of resistance in China has been articulated both in terms of workers and farmers or that, household say, live up to your socialist promise, which means equality, justice, class-based justice, rather than just, individual things. But then you also have external forces, denationalized Chinese nationalists. The sons of daughters of Chinese officials, as you know, many of those people who study in the West are the ones who come from China's upper-class or middle-class background. And they are the ones who try to protect the Chinese state from outside. So although the party state has tried all means to separate class politics from nationalistic politics, it is possible that these two forces may once again intertwine with each other and reinforce each other in particular historic juncture. So you don't know what will happen, but this is a kind of contingent. So, So this is really a complicated situation. How China evolves not only depends on social struggle within, but also how the U.S., really, the West, behave. In a sense, how are you going to articulate your own priorities, define your discourse? So if China must revisit its own developmental path and make it ecologically, socially, culturally sustainable, there are signs of such revisits as both elite and popular levels as result of intensified social structure, which is what I tried to describe earlier on. Then the West must look themselves into the mirror and overcome legacies of Orientalism, imperialism, anti-communism in their understanding of China. Of course, this is easy said than done. The complicated intersection of political economy, cultural politics of transnational capitalism pose profound challenges. And just talk about the Olympics. In the end, Bush went. In the end, the French president went. In the end, NBC put out this incredible show and has many positive things to say about China. In the end, they love the opening ceremony, although they don't like the fact that, you know, China never failed to provide scandals, right? The lip syncing stuff. But overall, this is the moment that fulfills this China's integration. Okay, so during the Maoist era, there's the slogan, right? Only socialism can save China. But then in the aftermath of the Asia financial crisis, you have this slogan in China saying that only China can save capitalism. Because the Chinese state, you know, at that point did not devalue the Chinese currency. So takes, you know, serve as a kind of cushion for global capitalism. So now, I don't know what, you know, I don't know if Confucianism or the way, you know, the Chinese media invoke it or Zhang Yimou invoke it can, because what they're arguing, a certain version of New Confucianism is, okay, in Confucianism, we talk about, you know, the harmony of nature, human beings, all that kind of thing, right? Or, you know, everybody is a friend, brothers, right? But that kind of moralistic appeal really doesn't help in address the real political economy of capitalist development. It doesn't have that. But you know, it's nice to put out this character harmony, but then it really sometimes justifies unequal political economic power and a concealed class politics. So here's my hopeful moment, right? Marx and Hegel always say, you know, things, good historical things and characters come to us, first as tragedy, second as farce. But then I said, well, maybe this is not the end of history. Maybe, you know, socialism, however you articulate it. And in China, there are many people who try to work towards a kind of post-Maoist new notion of socialism. For example, this one guy, again, a high-level official, who said, you know, what we need is ecological socialism. And so he said, you know, kind of surpass kind of consumerism, but at the same time redistribute, you know, kind of economic justice. So there's many right now in China, as I say, as a part of this revival of New Left, there's all kind of struggles to re-articulate a more democratic notion of socialism. And so in a sense of, you know, socialism might strike a third time as a reason or utopia, which is what Pierre Bourdieu has been saying. So I want to put forward that this more optimistic picture of that inside China. I'm not saying, you know, socialism is right now happening, but I want to say that partly, certainly not because the party state is articulating and say, well, we're still socialists. But I think it's the ordinary people's struggle to subject both the state and the market to social needs. That is very significant. And so Dan actually said that socialism is a process. I said, yes, okay, I accept you. It is a process. And it's the process of the ordinary people try to struggle for their sense of justice in China. But also, as I say, because of China's right now the position in the global political economy, and because the way the West have behaved in the Chinese eyes, that also necessarily involves a nationalist element. So how Chinese nationalism evolve really not just depends on China, but also depends on the West. That's why, you know, that question somebody posed is so important. That is what we can do. Because it really depends on a choice on the part of the U.S. whether you want to be a republic or empire, as Thomas Johnson put it. And that, I think, rests, a lot is at stake. And I think the creative industry, the humanities, all of you has a tremendous responsibility, of course, me. So I will stop here. I hope we can move on to discussion, right? Kate, do you want to come here to talk about the discussion?